So, thank you very much. So, just as a bit of an introduction, it's difficult coming after excellent speakers in the morning, but they've both done a great job. Fiona, who I do a lot of thinking with, but not a lot of doing stuff with, has given a great introduction to the theoretical background of where I'm coming from. One of the things that particularly struck me in Chris's presentation, which is worth bringing up, is this idea of the pyramid, which really resonated with me. It's something that happens in academia, that you end up just taking a few steps down the psychological individual economic approach or down the sociological social psychology approach, and then you end up really, really distant. I spent 15 years working on air pollution as a technical subject before doing the theory, so I got sort of dropped into the middle of the pyramid, and I don't have an academic bias towards one side or the other. I just tend to favour certain sides because they apply better to the problems that I'm generally faced with dealing with. And if Michael Sanders had been here this morning, he'd have probably talked about nudge and behavioural economics in a load of areas and scenarios in which it works really well. We're going to talk about the problem of air pollution and sort of why we're looking at it from a sociological, social practice perspective, and give hints as to why some of the more individualistic views don't necessarily work. So why is air pollution a problem? Basically, as a very quick introduction, it's about people's health. That's essentially the core bit of it. It's been forgotten in some of the policy processes about it being about people's health and healthy lives, and becomes about meeting technical standards. And that has led things to sort of issues about fuel and sort of issues about diesel and petrol, and we've encouraged people to buy the wrong sorts of cars which are actually more polluting for the localities. But it's still globally 1 in 8 deaths can be attributed statistically to air pollution. And that's, again, statistically, you can't point at individual corpses. It contributes to the deaths of many people, but it works out as 5 deaths a week in Bristol can be attributed to air pollution. So why haven't we fixed this already? One of the problems is that the whole way policy is set up is that air pollution is often dealt with as a separate problem. It's about meeting clean air. It's not looking at a range of other issues dealt with other bits of policy, about issues such as climate change, about transport, health, energy consumption, home heating, things that people actually do. It just ends up being this sort of environmental science issue out there. We've had another problem that a lot of policy has emphasised the risks of climate change and tried to tackle these only using technological measures, often at the expense of air pollution. So we can see that in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, it's the sort of push to get people to have diesel vehicles, which it was thought had lower CO2 emissions, but were far more polluting in terms of conventional air pollution. And we can also see it in people taking up wood burners. So they burn wood because it's, in theory, lower carbon, but is causing a real problem in many of our urban centres now. Where behaviour change has been considered, because these technical measures often just sort of consider things like the cleanliness of fuels or the cleanliness of vehicles. So increasingly we have these things called Euro standards, and it was believed that vehicles would simply get cleaner, and then it didn't matter how much people drove them because they'd be clean cars, and that hasn't worked out. But where there has been a consideration of behaviour change and trying to get people to do things differently, predominantly drive less, it has mainly focused on people as individuals and frames their environmentally damaging action as being a choice, i.e. you are choosing to drive this car where you drive it, and you are choosing to drive a dirtier car. And the work that we've been doing that comes out of the sociological theories sort of really rails against this notion that people have this free choice over everything, and that even if they did, the considerations of air pollution would be at the top of the factors why they make choices. So just to illustrate this, this is actually from a recent local residents group who reacted to some of the council measures in Easton about traffic reduction measures. And they start off saying these proposals as sort of, they don't seem to take into account the many and complex reasons for vehicle use by local residents, presenting a picture of a seamless tradition to an urban idyll where everyone has ample time to stroll to school or shops and still get to work on time. And everyone's job is local and easy to reach. In reality, most people's schedules and the demands of their lives necessitate independent transport. Simply taking steps to massively inconvenience them doesn't really seem to be engaging with the broader reasons behind vehicle use and ownership. So actually, this is just a sort of local residents group probably putting it better than I've ever heard academics putting the problem. It's just really, we're not choosing to do this. We're probably on side with most of the things you're trying to do, except we can't do it. We're doing all these other things which are leading to the problem. And then finally, again, linking to Chris's, by ignoring the challenges in people's lives and the complexity that goes on and the web of sort of social interactions and expectations on these people, you're potentially creating this divisive problem which causes some hostility. But it's also worth noting, I said it's just like the areas I work in the environment are much more suited to sociological approaches than some of the individualist approaches. If we look at some of the differences between health behaviours and environment behaviours, and I'm not saying in any way that public health behaviours can all be sorted by individualism, but within health behaviours, if you look at smoking and drinking, a lot of the risks that you're trying to prevent are risks that happen to the person who's taking the behaviour. It's the person who smokes suffers the lung damage predominantly, the person who drinks the liver damage and so forth. With air pollution, you're talking about source and receptor being completely different. People just drive through an area and it's the people left living in the area or shopping in the area that get to breathe the dirty air. The second issue about it, if I get these in the right order, is that it's very rarely the case with environmental problems that they're caused by an individual. There's a few cases, sort of dumping and stuff, you could look at it like that. But environmental problems only really happen as a result of mass collective action. One person driving down the road wouldn't be the problem. 10,000 people is. So actually the logic of individual action and individual responsibility begins to break down, and you have to look at the problems as being much more collective. It's the way that we all do things together. And another thing, and I'd tend to sort of come down actually against individual approaches, not just because they don't work for some of the problems, but actually I think they're antagonising the problem. There's a lot of other work, and I could refer people to a paper I'm just about having published about how the problem of increasing individualisation since the 1980s is leading to the problem. But here I'll just highlight a couple of things about why individual approaches are problematic. Question of what does an individual look like? If we take two possible stories and visions of an individual, first of all, we have the hero individual. You are the individual. You can create this global change yourself. It's all well and good. It might empower people to start with, but how long does that feeling of being an omnipotent individual last when they really try and grasp the problem? And then you might end up with the second vision of an individual, an atomised individual being with no social networks, no connections, isolated. They're supposed to act all on their own with no support and no contribution. So I think very much the language of individualism, it's linked in with some of the problems, and I don't think it gets us out of it very much. And if you ask people about why they don't do things, this is some of the research we've done in ClairCity, about why do Bristolians use cars, cycling facilities at my workplace aren't good, roads are unsafe, cycle routes are badly positioned, public transport takes far longer than the car, bus routes are unreliable and frequent. It's just one of the things that comes up. It's not just about individual choice, it's about some of the physical things in society, about how society is laid out in the ISM model, about the materiality of the problem. But we can also look at who are people and do they actually exist as individuals? What are you trying to engage with? This is Susie. Susie does lots of things. Susie's a parent. She goes shopping and buys things. She's a carer for her elderly parents. At weekends and sometimes in the evenings, she's a sports cyclist. During the daytime, she's a bus driver. So as an individual, she sort of sits at this nexus of all these activities. But that's not really helpful, because where the problems come is how you network all these activities together. It's what is it about the activities of parenting as societies that specifies them that lead this to quite often be a polluting activity with lots of chauffeuring of young children about. How is it being a bus driver actually getting to the bus depot before any of the buses are running? How do you deal with that issue? And so forth. And there's lots of these complex things that go on. But if we targeted the roles that people do rather than the individual people themselves, you might get to more of the issues. Again, looking at sort of why do Bristolians use cars, we went out and asked them these things, and things about train timetable and the duration of changes means that they can't get out to do the childcare and school runs. It's the things we expect people to do, to take a responsibility at the workplace and to take up responsible parenting. These can't be integrated neatly with the way we run the transport system. Again, we have found someone who's a carer who is just simply, you can't do the door-to-door caring responsibilities without being able to do it in a car in the way that the system works at the moment. So we've had discussions about rationality and agency, and we're not saying that people aren't rational, and we're not saying that they don't have agency. These things are both true and important, but actually they're both really constrained and determined by social structures. And in work that I started doing 10 years ago, you repeatedly go out and talk to people and they say, we want to be environmentally friendly, but we just can't. And putting pressure on us doesn't help. And in fact, if you want to get into the individual psychology of it, they end up feeling guilty and having negative emotions, and that gets no one anywhere very far. So within this project ClairCity, which has been trying to look at, actually, if you take these new approaches to looking at behaviour and institute them in a policy process that actually previously has had hardly any social science involved in it, what does it end up looking like? One of the things we spent the first year of the project really getting all the people on board to think about people and citizens rather than individuals. And it ends up being called citizen-led air pollution reduction in cities. And the difference is that individuals defined in the OED as a single human being, distinct from a particular group or society in general. Whereas if you talk about people as citizens, they're, as in relation to the place they live, they have civic rights, privileges and responsibilities. There's immediately this social bond, which I think is vital to start just simply the terminology of how you refer to people. Then goes into the context of how you treat them, how you see theories as differently. This is, Fiona showed this quickly, this is a piece of work that I did about 4 years ago now, and when I was coming around the tables earlier, one of the things I said to a number of groups was, what's really important is write what your problem behaviour is at the top of the piece of paper. You need to know exactly what it is you're dealing with, because then you can choose what's appropriate in the method. And here, to give a vague introduction, on one side we have sort of individual behaviours, psychological behaviours, one-off infrequent behaviours, and behaviours that aren't really linked to much. If Michael Sanders had been here this morning, he'd have probably have given a really successful government intervention on behavioural economics about filling out tax forms, which this sort of thing works really well for. What we're trying to get people to do is go out of their house in the morning, take a bicycle or a bus with the weather, with the poor infrastructure, to meet a lot of societal expectations about getting to work in a presentable state, about being able to do your shopping, your home, your parenting duties on the way back. And that as an identified sort of set of problem behaviours that you want to address end up being on the other end of these spectrums, and that opens the way to going, actually, we need a different set of tools that recognise these social issues. And so just to highlight a couple of things for further reading, I've just drop in 2 books by Elizabeth Schoaf, who was mentioned earlier, but particularly a little brochure we have on the website from the previous workshop. If you just type in fleximobility.solutions, there's a really neat little dissemination brochure that provides a lot more details to some of these transport things. But I'll now hand over to Corra and Laura. So those slides should be going round, so I've just sort of, if I didn't leave enough time for you to look at them.
Thank you very much. So I'm Laura Fogg-Rogers. I'm a science communication researcher at UE, and so I'm brought into this project to think about the communications. How do we get these messages across? What do we actually say to people? So the first thing that we've done is what Fiona was talking about earlier, was just bring lots of people together from all different sectors, institutions, countries, ways of looking at the problem, because this is a really complex problem, so we need lots of different ways. We need to speak to all these different ways of addressing this issue. And so it's an EU project funded across 6 different countries with 6 different pilot cities. And each of these cities is looking at this issue for their own citizens. And then at the end, we'll kind of look at, how does this work internationally as well? And the process, we're quantifying the data first. We're looking at what is the problem in the various different cities, what causes it. So it's not always transport in Britain, it's mainly transport causing air pollution issues. In other countries, like in Poland, it's actually home heating, so burning really poor fuels. So we're looking at that, quantifying it, trying to address it across both transport and health and air quality, all these different sectors that don't talk to each other. I was quite surprised by that, why aren't these people talking to each other? But that's the first stage of the project. Then we've been going out to the public, so citizens in our cities, but we've not been trying to change their behaviour. We're going out asking them. So the data that Tim showed was about engaging with people and just discussing, how does it work in this city? Where and how do you go places? Why do you do things? What's happening? So that we get a better understanding. And then we're working towards producing solutions. So we have next year, we have schools engagement, work with elderly people, apps, games, etc. But we're working towards a policy package. So this will be ultimately in 2019 delivering something to the council to say, these are the things that could work in this city. And so ultimately our project isn't about changing the behaviour of people, citizens, it's about changing the behaviour of the behaviour changers. So this is the idea that we're not going out and asking individuals to solve this problem and inconvenience themselves and make their own lives difficult. That's not rational if we're talking about rationality. Instead, we need to try and make society different and enable people to do these things. We talked about making it be easy, making it be the norm. That's what we're working towards. And in order to do that, we need the structures, so all the things we've heard about before, materiality, environments, etc., to change. And so we need the people who are in charge of those environments to do something. So we're working with councils, we've been working with the people who make these decisions within their organisations, and also some of the softer organisations as well. And so we're trying to break this, the dichotomy between policy and individuals. So before that, we're going then into all the places where we perform all these roles, all these social structures, the places where we are people that connect with other people like us. So in our clubs, societies, scout groups, employers is a big one, families, friends, where we have to perform these social roles together. And then it's about changing, we hope, those social norms that enable people to do things. So there is the hard infrastructure there. So this might be, in our case, cycle paths, or making things easier, or run better, or buses that actually go places. But it's also the soft infrastructure as well, so what we expect to be normal. It's okay for Tim to turn up in a t-shirt and shorts, which he frequently does. But that's okay, we expect that now, that's the social norm. So we've been thinking about that, about these messages that we can give to people. So if we were talking to individuals on the left, it would be things like, stop polluting, buy a bike, learn to ride, do this differently. Whereas if we're not talking to the individuals, if we're talking to society, we go more towards the council, the government, about enabling things to happen. So instead, for the government, fund cycle routes and networks, tax incentives, employers, invest in research and so on. So we're trying to speak to the behaviour changers to do things differently so things can happen in society. but we are also talking to actual people as well. And not that they're not actual people, but I'm not sure. So this is Corra who will do the next part.
So as Laura mentioned, as well as channeling the information we're finding to these groups who can then take decisions and make changes, we've been doing a whole load of public engagement in each of our 6 cities. So here's some pictures of what that looks like in Bristol. So one thing that was really important for us was making sure that we were talking to people in their different groups, as Laura was mentioning, in the different roles that they're performing. So that meant going to lots and lots of different types of events. We put out an open call and got in touch with pretty much every organisation, with a few exceptions, on the VOSCOR, on the kind of voluntary sector listings, asking them if they were interested in air pollution, if they would be interested in us coming and talking to them, and had a whole range of responses. So we went to a transgender support group because they invited us in. We went to the Bristol 10K and spoke to people, not the runners, we let them carry on running, but the family members for people who were supporting their runners in the city centre. We went to neighbourhood festivals across the city. We went to city centre festivals during the summer. We went to British Lung Foundation support group. We went to Southmead Hospital. Lots and lots of different locations where people were going about their daily lives. We were trying to find them as they went around their business rather than expecting them to come and have this massive burning issue that was shared with us to care about air pollution so much. So we've been doing that across the city, and we'll be doing a whole load of that again next year, and that's happening across all of our 6 partner cities. And the other thing to point out is, as we've been talking about, kind of local authorities are a key decision maker and a behaviour former. And one of the things with this project that was really important was for us not just to do all this research as academics and then turn around and expect to be listened to. But again, from the very beginning, we've had the 6 cities where we're working, the local authorities for each of those cities or those regions are actually partners on the project. So one of them is in the room. Hi, Mark, wherever you are. Hi, Bristol. So that's been really important for the project in terms of kind of thinking about it coming from academia, but also from whichever group to think about, okay, well, how are we making sure that the partnerships we need to make some of these things happen and that we need to implement some of these actions, how are we actually building that into the fabric of what we're doing from the start rather than just expecting to be listened to at the end. And again with that, we've been working with local organisations as well as working with them as they're working with their various publics, actually inviting organisations in to do a mutual learning workshop and to keep them updated and to keep them involved in the project, which has already been happening. So we've kind of already instituted that for Bristol and will continue happening. The same thing with some large employers. They're going to be involved in an app project that we're developing that will be happening next year. So some conference next year, you'll probably hear at least one of us talking about that. To make sure that we're not, again, just kind of thinking that this is about a problem and a load of individuals dealing with it, but actually who are the different organisations or different groups or different decision-making locations where something could actually be done to change it. So, citizens, that's what we're interested in. I think at the very beginning there's something about people at the heart was a Natural England phrase, so the ClairCity version is citizen at the centre. Because citizens have rights as well, people just floating around as people. And working out in our practice, this is how we've come to put them at the centre of policy and practice, but it'd be really interesting to hear any other examples or other ideas for how that's happening through other projects. That's us. I'll invite my co-speakers back up. I think we've left ourselves a few minutes for questions.
Yes,
I think.
very good.
Yeah, is that okay?
Efficient.
Yeah.
Not only 3 of you, but very sharp.
We're
going to have them back. We're going to have them back. So yes, questions from the floor. If you need a microphone, ask for one. But just to keep things moving, I'll say try and just speak out into the room, and if necessary, I'm sure these guys can repeat the question for people. So I'm sure there are loads of questions.
That's great. That's really interesting. My question is, if a lot of the issues are kind of societal, how do we change those?
I'll use the mic.
So I'm not saying we're going to solve the world, because we might not, but within our four-year project, what we're aiming to do is kind of understand the issue more. So this is, all the things we've talked about before, rationality versus irrationality. I suppose we're going at it with deeper understanding of that. So that's the public engagement aspect. Once you understand what's going on, we can then think about solutions that might address those issues. So I talk about barriers to people doing things, but that's not liked in social practice. But we're looking at kind of how can we solve these issues, And then we're also, one of our aspects is we're actually then getting citizens to kind of vote on the solutions. So there's a game where they can kind of say if they like them or not. And then it's the suite of policy measures to go to the change makers. And so with all environmental issues, it's not going to be one, a silver bullet. It's lots and lots of different things building up, making change over time. And that's what the policy package is about. So ultimately, we need people to drive less or have cleaner technology that they use only when they need it. But how do we as a society get there? And that's what we're thinking about. Yeah. Without inconveniencing everyone, like that quote, yeah. All the way at the back.
Hello. I'm wondering if you're seeing any cultural differences in what you're seeing in the different cities and countries. Maybe in some countries, the idea of citizen is fairly obvious. I can see how in the UK, maybe not so much after so many years of Thatcherism, etc. I mean, what kind of differences are you noticing?
Yeah, lots. In some respects lots, and in other respects actually they've been more similar than I might have guessed. So from, like you say, from the very beginning, translating things, whether citizen is a word that means something to a population, and whether we use that word when we're talking to groups or talking with groups in those populations, or whether something like residents or local people, what sits better, what do people feel themselves to be. In Polish and Slovenian we are residents, in Italian and Portuguese we are citizens in most of our direct communications. So there are differences. And then in terms of so there's differences in the actual underlying air pollution problems in the different cities. So we kind of have the quantification team managing that, and we know that. We've just started doing our first round of surveys and sort of public engagement in 5 of the 6 cities have now started. The last one is in November. There's differences in how willing people are to fill in a survey, but there's also a lot of similarities about like, oh look, what a finding, no one loves surveys. But the different cities and different kind of cultural practices have suggested different locations. So I talked about where we've gone in Bristol. In the other cities they've gone to quite different places. So in the city in Poland that we're working with, church groups have actually got on board, and that's been quite an important way for some of the data collection in terms of like where is a place that people go on a regular basis where they've got a moment to think about this or to talk about this, or they'd be willing to have that kind of conversation.
And just to add, so initially within the project, that was quite a barrier. That the idea was we'd just have an online survey and kind of expect people to come to us, and that was a real communications barrier for us, that we had to get all our project partners to think of different ways of speaking to people. So don't just expect them to come to you and immediately want to take part. Go to where they are, go to places where we wouldn't normally go differently, people who aren't like you, and how important it is to try and get that the different demographic breakdown, so that it's not all just white middle class people who are environmentalists kind of having their say. So that's been a big thing, hasn't it? Breaking that down.
Particularly regarding where choice lies in policy and regarding individualism. 2 of the cities we've looked at really early regarding the policy level has been Bristol and Amsterdam. And there are expectations as both quite neoliberal countries in northwestern Europe, they'd be really quite similar. But when it came down to it, the interpretations of neoliberalism come out quite differently. So in Amsterdam, the idea of behaviour change is you just can't do it. People are free-willed individuals, they will go and do this. Therefore, the role of government and the role of local government is to structure society so that people are going to do what you'd quite like them to do. So loads of cheap public transport, loads of cycle paths, flexible working so you can actually structure your day around making these choices. What seems to be the UK interpretation of neoliberalism is that we will vaguely tell people what we want them to do and provide them absolutely no support in doing it. And so it's just like these things, even at the level of being sort of quite similar political ideologies, there are sort of choices at that level how they're carried out and interpreted.
I can understand why you wanted to target the decision makers like the local authorities as bringing about making changes to help people make their own decisions. But I mean, the reality on the ground is quite different. I mean, councils are just getting more and more hammered by cuts. My local district council, which is quite small, is looking at another £9 million worth of cuts in the coming financial year. So I would imagine that actually targeting them is not really going to be very fruitful and bring about what you want. But I wondered, see, I've touched on a little nerve there, but I also wondered if there's no mention of companies. Now, in the recent years, I've become aware that corporate companies, I think probably are, they're doing so much now to be more sustainable and to support communities. But how do you see their role playing in what you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say a lot of it is focused on policy, but in things like the mutual learning workshop, it's really particularly getting employers, businesses, service providers to become involved. The brochure that I showed on flexi-mobility, that specifically looked at these roles that, and in the policy individuals dichotomy slide, it's not just looking at policy to do things, but local governments as a communicator and a facilitator for all these individual parties, so all these social structures pick up their role and the responsibility in doing things, because basically businesses all tend to have a business model that relies on unrestricted car use, that people will come and drive to my shop, and yet they're not really effectively taxed or made to contribute to that sort of transport generation that is going on.
So, yes, and also we have an app coming out next year which will entirely target businesses and employees. So, and they are listed in kind of the things that people could do. But the other interesting sort of cultural differences is when we started the project, we weren't as cut as we were. And then just as we started the project, so just as we're about to launch our public engagement, PERDA happened. It was the general election, so we weren't allowed to say anything. And then also, every organisation that we went to try and say, could you help us reach your your people who do something or other, they're all like, well, why should we? We've just had all our funding cut. So we came out into, it was a very difficult political environment, we can say that, it's fact. So yeah, it was difficult politically, and we've had to find other ways around reaching people. And we've really thought hard about how do we do things for organisations so they get something from doing something for us. So one of the things we did was we've gone out to organisations and given talks or raised awareness or done things with them so that they then feel willing to do something with us. So we've had to just basically think differently about how to engage with people.
Can I give one more opportunity? Mark Leach from Bristol City Council is in the room, just in case you wanted to have any comment about responding to that question.
Mark?
I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject, and the thing I'm really interested in is how that difference has happened between Amsterdam and Bristol, because it feels a little bit like there's just a sort of bit of magic, really, that the local government in Amsterdam were able to spend a lot of money and provide that infrastructure and support that Tim, you quite rightly point out, isn't here in the UK in the same way. And I'm just kind of wondering, is there some kind of engagement or behaviour change kind of looking at a bigger loop in terms of the change here? How do we enable a society that actually allows our politicians to go further? Because the reason in the UK that we don't provide those services is because we don't spend money, and the reason for that is because if politicians do that, they'll get voted out. So I think there's another kind of engagement and behaviour change that no one talks about really. We talk about the individualised, you get on your bike and go to work. I'm sounding like a Norman Tebbit now, but and what we don't talk about is a bigger, more systemic picture. I mean, the kind of systems thinking in terms of that wider behaviour change. That probably wasn't the kind of thing you wanted from me, Corra, when you gave me the mic, but anyway, there you go.
I think you're absolutely right that, you know, most environmental problems are long-term problems that are going to inconvenience people in the short term, and so that's not politically popular. So it is thinking about ways to do things differently and work with people to think about that together in a way that appeals to our values. We saw the values as well before, so trying to think about those things that we share together and we want together.
Time for one more quick one. Let's go right at the back. There'll be a chance at the end of the day, remember, to talk to
This will be one of those end of news night, end of question time questions. What's your favourite colour? No, the question is, you said that people are rational, that they have agency, but they're constrained by social structures. Do you, in your quiet time, in your downtime, imagine totally different social structures?
Yes, I think it's the answer. I mean, one of the things, and it goes back to Mark's question, is one of the keywords that hangs out of a lot of this theory work is becoming this term cultural conventions. It's just sort of how do people think about stuff, and it is possible to change this stuff. And I mean, get in contact with me. I've had a paper accepted. It's waiting to come out in a journal, which touches on how there has been a political process that has restructured society since the 1980s, which is forcing people into thinking they're individuals and behaving like individuals. This goes through school choice, it goes through personal finance, it goes through the way the transportation system's structured. It is possible to do these things, but they're built into society, and so there is a big push to do it in other ways. And you can see that, I mean, just in Amsterdam, it is a society that you walk out when we go to research meetings, you go out there and it is a different society. You just see people's faces whirring past you on two wheels at a rate of knots. The degree of sort of face-to-face interaction becomes much greater within that society than if everyone was in their tin boxes. And we haven't explored what the outcomes about this are, but certainly how you structure that society gives you a very different impression of some of the more intimate things, like what is my relationship between me and those other people who are travelling down my street.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, Tony, for later, over a beer. Thank you very much to Tim, Laura,